Picture this, 50,000 Romans screaming as a man fights for his life with a trident and net against an opponent armed with a gladius and shield. One will walk out. One will bleed out in the sand. But here's what they don't tell you, neither of them wants to be there. The gladiator. The word itself conjures images of muscle-bound warriors, heroic combat, Russell Crowe shouting about honor. But strip away the gloss, and you'll find something far more disturbing. A system of state-sponsored violence built on slavery, desperation, and Rome's insatiable hunger for spectacle. This is the story of who these fighters really were, how they lived in the shadow of death, and why an entire civilization became addicted to watching human beings tear each other apart. Let's go back to Rome at its height, the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. The empire stretches from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. It's the most powerful civilization on earth, and it's bored. Roman citizens, particularly in the capital, demand entertainment. Not just any entertainment, they want drama, danger, spectacle. They want to feel something in a world where Rome's legions have conquered virtually everyone worth conquering. The solution? The Munera, gladiatorial games. Public events where trained fighters battle to the death while crowds place bets, wave handkerchiefs, and eat snacks. But who were these gladiators? Here's the first myth we need to destroy. Gladiators weren't volunteers seeking glory. The vast majority were slaves. Prisoners of war, captured during Rome's endless military campaigns. Criminals sentenced to the arena instead of execution. Men who had committed crimes against the state, debtors, sometimes even the politically inconvenient. These weren't warriors choosing honor, these were human beings stripped of every choice, forced to kill or be killed for someone else's amusement. When a new batch of prisoners arrived in Rome, they were assessed. The strong, the young, the physically capable, these were valuable. Not valuable enough to free, but valuable enough to train. They were sold to a lanista, a gladiator manager, who ran a ludus, a gladiator school. Think of it as part prison, part training facility, part human warehouse. The lanista was a businessman. He'd purchased these men as one might purchase livestock, and he intended to profit. Every gladiator represented an investment. Feed them enough to build muscle, but not so much that you waste money. Train them to fight efficiently, to put on a good show, to survive long enough to fight again. The economics were brutal but simple. A dead gladiator was a sunk cost, but a winning gladiator could fight dozens of times, earning his owner thousands of sesterces. Life in the ludus was regimented and harsh. Gladiators lived in cells, often shackled at night to prevent escape or suicide, because suicide was common. These men knew what awaited them. They trained for hours each day under former gladiators who'd won their freedom, learning the specific fighting styles that would define their arena persona. There were multiple types of gladiators, each with distinct weapons and armor. The Murmillo fought with a gladius, a short sword, and a large rectangular shield, wearing a helmet with a fish crest. The Retiarius carried a trident, a dagger, and a weighted net, fighting with minimal armor and relying on speed. The Thraex wielded a curved Sicca sword and a small square shield. Each type had advantages and disadvantages, carefully designed to create dramatic matchups. The training was brutal and specific. These men weren't learning to win wars, they were learning to entertain. A quick, efficient kill might be practical in battle, but it was boring in the arena. Gladiators were taught to wound dramatically, to create moments of tension, to play to the crowd. They learned to fall convincingly, to appeal for mercy with specific gestures, to recognize when their opponent was truly beaten versus when they were faking vulnerability. And here's something that might surprise you. Despite being slaves, despite facing death regularly, some gladiators became celebrities. The best fighters developed fan bases. Women from wealthy families would send them gifts, love letters. Their images appeared on lamps, pottery, graffiti. Children played gladiator games in the streets, mimicking their favorites. A successful gladiator could become more famous than senators, though he'd still be sleeping in chains. But fame didn't mean freedom. Fame didn't mean safety. Because eventually, every gladiator faced the same appointment, the arena itself, where 50,000 voices would decide if he lived or died. And that's where our story really begins, in the blood-soaked sand where Rome's entertainment machine devoured human lives, one spectacular death at a time. The wooden sword strikes flesh with a crack that echoes across the training yard. Blood drips onto the sand. But this isn't the arena, this is practice. And the man bleeding today is being shaped into something Rome desperately craves, a professional killer who'll die beautifully. Training a gladiator wasn't like training a soldier. Soldiers were taught to fight as units, to maintain formation, to win wars efficiently. Gladiators were being programmed for something entirely different. Ritualized violence as performance art. Every movement, every strike, every defensive stance had to serve two masters, survival and spectacle. The ludus operated on a strict hierarchy. At the bottom were the novitius, the new arrivals, recently enslaved, still processing the horror of their situation. Many were prisoners from Rome's conquered territories, Gauls with their long hair, Germanic tribesmen covered in scars, North Africans, Greeks, Syrians. They came from warrior cultures, yes, but arena combat followed rules their battlefield experience hadn't prepared them for. Above the novitius were the veteranus, veteran gladiators who'd survived multiple fights. These men had learned the unspoken truth: in the arena, dying bravely was sometimes more valuable than living as a coward. A gladiator who fought with skill and courage, even in defeat, might receive missio, a reprieve from death. But a gladiator who begged, who cowered, who refused to fight, the crowd would demand his execution, and the editor, the game's sponsor, would have no choice but to comply. The training itself was overseen by doctors, instructors who were often former gladiators. These men had survived the arena and won their freedom through skill or accumulated victories. Now they sold that knowledge, teaching the specific techniques of each gladiator type. The doctor for the Murmillo taught different tactics than the doctor for the Retiarius. It was specialized knowledge, passed down through generations of bloodshed. The diet was controlled and specific. Gladiators ate primarily barley, beans, and dried fruit, a high-carbohydrate regimen designed to build a layer of fat over muscle. Why? Because in the arena, shallow cuts bled dramatically and pleased crowds, but that layer of fat helped prevent deep, immediately lethal wounds. The gladiators even had a nickname based on this diet, horderii, barley men. They were being fattened like cattle, their bodies modified to bleed better for entertainment. Physical training consumed most of the day. Gladiators worked with the paulus, a 6-foot wooden post planted in the ground, striking it thousands of times to build muscle memory. They practiced with weighted wooden weapons, heavier than the real ones they'd use in combat. The logic was simple: train heavy, fight light. When they finally held a real gladius or trident, it would feel effortless. But the training went beyond physical conditioning. Gladiators learned showmanship. They practiced entering the arena with the right swagger, acknowledging the crowd, playing to different sections. They learned the salute: Ave, Imperator, morituri te salutant, Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. Though interestingly, historians debate whether this phrase was actually common or just something said once and dramatized later. Either way, the gladiator had to project confidence, even when terror churned in his gut. They also learned the signals. The raising of the finger, the pollice verso, which may have indicated either mercy or death, depending on interpretation. The throwing down of weapons to signal surrender. The gestures to appeal to the crowd, to make them invested in your survival. Because in the end, the editor might have formal authority, but he'd rarely go against a unified crowd. If 50,000 Romans wanted you to live, you'd probably live. If they wanted you dead, no amount of skill would save you. Psychological preparation was perhaps the cruelest aspect. The doctors worked to break down the slave's previous identity and rebuild him as a gladiator. Your name didn't matter, you'd be given a stage name, often related to your fighting style or origin. Your past didn't matter, you were reborn as an instrument of violence. Some men broke completely under this pressure. Others found a strange solace in the structure, the clear purpose, even if that purpose was horrifying. The ludus also housed different classifications of fighters. The damnati ad gladium were criminals sentenced to die in the arena. They received minimal training because they weren't expected to survive. They were morning warm-up acts, executed by professional gladiators or wild animals while crowds filtered in. Then there were the auctorati. Technically free men who'd voluntarily signed contracts to fight as gladiators, usually out of desperate poverty or crushing debt. They were rare, but their existence proved something dark about Roman economics. Some free men found slavery preferable to freedom's alternatives. At night, gladiators were locked in their cells. Some were chained. Suicide watch was constant because many chose to die on their own terms rather than in the sand. Historical records mention gladiators who strangled themselves, who refused food until they starved, who found creative ways to end their lives before the games could claim them. The lanista saw this as pure financial loss, an investment destroyed before it could generate returns. Yet bonds formed in these terrible conditions. Gladiators from the same ludus were called brothers, familia gladiatoria. They trained together, ate together, faced death together. When two men from the same school were matched against each other in the arena, it was considered especially tragic and dramatic. The crowd loved it. Two brothers, forged in the same brutal fires, now forced to kill each other for entertainment. Some gladiators worshipped specific gods. Hercules was popular. A hero who'd also been enslaved and performed labors for others. Nemesis, goddess of revenge, attracted those who'd been wrongly enslaved. Small shrines existed in some ludus facilities where men could pray before fights, making offerings for victory or a quick death. The final stage of preparation came days before a fight. The gladiator would be given better food, meat, wine, to build strength and improve his appearance. He'd be groomed, oiled, presented to the public at pre-games banquets where Romans could view the fighters up close, place bets, assess odds. The gladiators would eat this ceremonial meal, the sine labora, knowing it might be their last. Some ate ravenously. Others couldn't swallow a bite. And then came the morning of the games, when everything they'd trained for would be tested against an opponent who trained just as hard, wanted to live just as desperately, and was just as terrified beneath the bravado. The machinery of Roman entertainment was about to consume them both. Only one question remained: who would emerge from the sand, and who would be dragged out by hooks, just another corpse for Rome's insatiable appetite. Dawn breaks over Rome, and the city is already awake. Not for work, for slaughter. Today, the games begin. In their cells, gladiators can hear it, the rumble of thousands of feet, the distant roar of the crowd gathering like a beast stirring from sleep. In a few hours, some of these men will be dead. They just don't know which ones yet. The Colosseum, or as Romans called it, the Amphitheatrum Flavium, could hold 50,000 spectators. 50,000 people gathering for a single purpose, to watch human beings fight and die. The crowd represented every level of Roman society, though they sat strictly segregated by class. Senators in the front rows, cushioned seats, perfect views. Equestrians, the wealthy business class, just behind them. Common citizens in the upper tiers. Women and slaves in the absolute highest sections, looking down from dizzying heights where the fighters appeared as small as insects. The games didn't start with gladiators. That would be poor showmanship. Rome understood pacing, understood building anticipation. The morning began with the venations, animal hunts. Exotic creatures shipped from across the empire were released into the arena: lions from Africa, bears from Germania, elephants, leopards, ostriches. Skilled hunters called venators would fight them with spears and arrows while the crowd warmed up, placing early bets, eating bread and olives, socializing. Then came the executions. The damnati ad bestias, criminals condemned to be killed by wild animals. These weren't fights. These were public executions dressed as entertainment. Men and women, yes, women too, were tied to posts or sent into the arena unarmed to be mauled to death by starved beasts. The crowd viewed this as justice, as moral instruction. These were enemies of Rome, criminals, Christians refusing to worship Roman gods. They deserved this, the thinking went. Their screams were proof that Rome's order was maintained. Other executions were staged as mythological reenactments. A criminal might be dressed as Orpheus and torn apart by bears. Another might play Icarus, strapped to a device that would drop him to his death. Rome had industrialized death and made it theatrical. Engineers designed elaborate stage machinery, the pegma, platforms that could rise from beneath the arena floor, releasing animals or transforming the space. Stagehands worked in the hypogeum, the underground tunnels and chambers below the arena, operating an elaborate system of pulleys, ramps, and trapdoors. By midday, the warm-up acts were finished. Now came what everyone had truly gathered for, the gladiators. The fighters emerged from the underground passages into blinding sunlight and deafening noise. Imagine the sensory assault. The roar of 50,000 voices, the smell of blood and sand and sweat, the glare of sun reflecting off marble seats. Your mouth is dry. Your heart hammers. The weight of your weapon feels simultaneously too heavy and too light. This is it. This is the moment everything has been building toward. The gladiators first paraded around the arena in the Pampa, a procession designed to build excitement. They wore their armor polished to shine, weapons gleaming. Musicians played horns and drums. The fighters would stop before the editor's box, usually a wealthy magistrate or senator sponsoring the games, sometimes the emperor himself, and perform their salute. The crowd assessed them like racehorses, shouting names of favorites, jeering at those they'd bet against. Then came the probatio armorum. The testing of weapons. Officials inspected the gladiators' equipment to ensure it was legitimate, that blades were sharp, that armor was regulation. This wasn't about fairness in a moral sense, it was about fairness for betting purposes. The games were heavily wagered on, and Romans demanded that fights be genuine contests, not fixed outcomes. The matchups had been announced days earlier on public notices painted on walls throughout the city. Romans studied these like sports fans studying statistics. They knew the fighters' records, their styles, their previous victories. A Murmillo versus a Retiarius was a classic matchup, heavy armor and sword against speed and net. A Thraex versus a Hoplomachus offered different dynamics. The editor and his staff carefully designed the day's program to provide variety, to create compelling narratives. When the fight began, it wasn't the chaotic brawl Hollywood depicts. These were trained professionals following understood rules. A referee, the summa rudis, officiated, carrying a long wooden staff to separate fighters if needed. He enforced regulations, no striking a downed opponent who'd surrendered, no continuing after a yield signal, proper acknowledgement of the crowd. The combat itself was brutal but tactical. Each gladiator type had specific advantages. The Retiarius had range with his trident and mobility without heavy armor, but if the Murmillo got inside his reach with that big shield, the Retiarius was vulnerable. The Murmillo had protection but limited visibility through his helmet and reduced mobility. They circled, feinted, tested defenses. Blood came quickly. A trident through the shoulder. A gladius slash across the thigh. The crowd's roar shifted in pitch. Excited gasps for serious wounds, appreciative murmurs for skilled defensive moves. This wasn't mindless violence to them. They were connoisseurs, judging technique, courage, strategy. And here's what modern people often misunderstand: not every fight ended in death. In fact, most didn't. Gladiators were expensive investments. The lanista who owned them wanted them to survive and fight again. The editor sponsoring the games paid rental fees for these fighters. Fees that increased dramatically if a gladiator died in his games. Death was the expensive outcome. When a gladiator was beaten, disarmed, wounded, unable to continue, he could request missio, a reprieve. He'd drop his weapon, raise a finger, appeal to the editor. The crowd would respond. If he'd fought bravely, shown skill and courage, they'd wave handkerchiefs, shout for mercy. The editor, reading the room, would grant missio. The defeated fighter would live to fight another day. But if the gladiator had fought poorly, had shown cowardice, had disappointed the crowd, the thumbs would turn. The exact gesture is debated by historians. Pollice verso means, turn thumb, but which direction indicated death versus mercy is unclear. What's certain is that the signal was unmistakable. And if the crowd wanted death, the editor would nod. The victorious gladiator would approach his fallen opponent, position his blade, and strike the killing blow, usually a thrust into the neck or between the shoulder blades into the heart. The fallen fighter was expected to die with dignity. To accept the blade without flinching, to prove Roman virtues even in defeat. This was the final performance, and the crowd judged it harshly. A good death could redeem a poor fight. A cowardly death damned even a brave warrior's memory. Once dead, the body was tested with a hot iron poker. The Romans were paranoid about fake deaths, then dragged from the arena with hooks. Attendants dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the dead, or Hermes Psychopompus, guide of souls, performed this task. The body was hauled through the Portal Abitnensis, the gate of death, to a spoliarium, a room where armor was stripped from corpses and wounds were examined by curious physicians studying anatomy. The sand was raked clean, fresh sand spread over bloodstains. And then the next fight began. And the next. And the next. A full day of games might feature 20 or 30 gladiatorial bouts, interspersed with animal fights, executions, even mock naval battles if the arena was flooded with water. By sunset, the sand was dark with blood. Bodies were counted, winners celebrated. The survivors limped back to their cells, wounds bandaged, knowing they'd earned a few more weeks of life. Until the next games. Until the next crowd. Until the sand claimed them, as it eventually claimed everyone who entered the arena. Rome had turned death into a schedule, violence into a season ticket, human suffering into the greatest show on earth. His name is scrawled across the city in charcoal and paint. Celadus the Thraex, 3 times victor, makes the girls swoon. Women send him perfumed letters. Children mimic his fighting stance in the streets. He's more famous than senators, more desired than poets. He's also a slave who sleeps in chains and will probably die before he's 30. Welcome to the paradox of the gladiator celebrity. This is where the story gets complicated, where our modern minds struggle to reconcile the contradictions. Because while gladiators were slaves, property, legally speaking, the successful ones occupied a bizarre space in Roman culture. They were simultaneously the lowest of the low and objects of intense fascination, even worship. The transformation from anonymous slave to arena celebrity happened through victories. A gladiator who won consistently, who fought with skill and flair, who understood how to work the crowd, this man became valuable beyond his basic price. His lanista would rent him out for higher fees. His image would appear on oil lamps, pottery, mosaics. Merchants paid to use his name and likeness to sell products. Sound familiar? Rome invented sports marketing 2,000 years before Nike. The absolute top-tier gladiators earned privileges unimaginable for typical slaves. They might be allowed to live outside the ludus in private quarters, though still under guard. They could accumulate prize money, peculium, saved from bonuses awarded by generous editors after particularly spectacular fights. Some gladiators became wealthy, at least by the standards available to slaves. And then there were the women. Roman women's fascination with gladiators scandalized moralists and fueled endless gossip. High-born ladies would send gifts to fighters, jewelry, fine fabrics, love notes. Some sought private encounters. The Latin poet Juvenal wrote with disgust about a senator's wife who left her husband to run off with a gladiator, abandoning wealth and status for a scarred slave who could be killed in the next games. What drove this attraction? Psychologists might point to the danger, the physical prowess, the ultimate bad boy appeal. These men represented everything Roman society officially condemned: violence, lower-class status, moral pollution from killing for entertainment, yet they embodied a raw masculine power that apparently proved irresistible to some women. The gladiator combined vulnerability, he could die at any moment, with dominance, he killed other men publicly. It was intoxicating, forbidden, dangerous. Graffiti from Pompeii, preserved by volcanic ash, gives us direct evidence. Celadus the Thraex, the girl's hero and glory. Crescens the Retiarius holds the hearts of all the girls. These weren't official inscriptions, they were scratched into walls by besotted fans, the ancient equivalent of "I heart Celadus" carved into a school desk. But let's be absolutely clear, this celebrity came with a horrifying price. Fame didn't equal freedom. A famous gladiator was still property, still subject to his owner's whims, still destined for the arena. His value just meant his owner would preserve him longer, milk more fights from him, keep him alive to generate more revenue. The gilded cage was still a cage. Some gladiators did achieve actual freedom. After years of victory, accumulating that peculium, they could potentially purchase their manumission, their legal freedom. Or an extraordinarily generous owner might grant it. The symbol of this freedom was the rudis, a wooden sword presented in ceremony. The freed gladiator became a rutiarius, technically free but often continuing to fight for pay or working as a trainer. The most famous gladiator in Roman history exemplifies both the heights of celebrity and the ultimate futility of the entire system. His name was Spartacus, a Thracian who'd been enslaved and trained as a gladiator. In 73 BCE, he led a revolt that should have been impossible. He and 73 other gladiators escaped from a ludus in Capua using kitchen knives. They armed themselves, fled to Mount Vesuvius, and began attracting other escaped slaves. What started as a desperate break for freedom became the most dangerous slave rebellion in Roman history. Spartacus's army grew to 70,000, escaped slaves, gladiators, desperate people with nothing to lose. They defeated Roman legions, not once but repeatedly. For 2 years, Spartacus humiliated Rome's military, turning trained killers back against their masters. But Rome couldn't allow such rebellion to succeed. It would undermine the entire social order, the entire economy built on slavery. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's richest men, assembled a force of 40,000 legionaries. The war became brutal. Crassus used decimation, executing every 10th man in units that showed cowardice, to terrorize his own troops into fighting harder. Spartacus tried to escape Italy, to get his people across the Alps to freedom, but was betrayed by pirates who promised ships and then abandoned him. The final battle came in 71 BCE in Lucania. Spartacus's army was crushed. He died fighting. Sources say he tried desperately to reach Crassus himself, to kill the general, but was cut down by centurions. His body was never found among the thousands of dead. Rome's revenge was methodical and meant as a message. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road from Rome to Capua. 6,000 crosses, stretching for over 100 miles, bodies left to rot as a warning to anyone who might dream of freedom. The rebellion failed, but Spartacus became legend. Even in failure, he'd proven that gladiators weren't just trained animals, they were men capable of military genius, leadership, organized resistance. Rome became more careful after Spartacus, more controlling of gladiatorial schools, more paranoid about too many trained fighters in one place. Yet the games continued. If anything, they intensified. Emperors used gladiatorial games to secure popularity, to distract from political problems, to demonstrate power. The phrase, bread and circuses, panem et circenses, summed up the strategy: keep the masses fed and entertained, and they won't revolt. Gladiators were essential to this system. Some emperors took the fascination too far. Commodus, who ruled from 180 to 192 CE, actually fought as a gladiator himself. This wasn't symbolic or ceremonial, he entered the arena regularly, fighting opponents and animals. Of course, his opponents were given blunted weapons and ordered to lose, making him technically undefeated. He declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules, dressed in lion skins, and genuinely seemed to believe his own propaganda. The Senate was horrified, an emperor debasing himself by fighting like a slave, but the common people loved it. It was the ultimate celebrity spectacle. The relationship between gladiators and Roman society reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. We can intellectually condemn slavery, recognize the immorality of blood sports, understand the systemic cruelty, and still be fascinated by the individuals within that system. The Romans knew these men were slaves. They knew the games were brutal. They knew it was built on suffering. They showed up anyway, by the tens of thousands, and screamed themselves hoarse. The gladiator lived in this impossible contradiction, famous but enslaved, wealthy but owned, beloved but disposable. He could have fan clubs and marriage proposals and his face on merchandise, and still die in the sand like an animal when his luck ran out. He represented Rome's ultimate hypocrisy, celebrating freedom and virtue while building an entertainment industry on human bondage. And the worst part? Some of it worked. Some gladiators internalized the system, took pride in their victories, found identity in their arena names. Stockholm Syndrome before we had a word for it. They were victims who became complicit, trapped in a machine that ground them down while telling them they were glorious. 404 CE. The Colosseum sits silent. No roar of crowds. No clash of steel. No blood in the sand. After 5 centuries of slaughter, the games are dying. Not because Rome suddenly developed a conscience, but because Rome itself is dying. And in the end, the gladiators outlived the empire that enslaved them. The beginning of the end came not from moral awakening but from practical reality. By the 3rd century CE, Rome was hemorrhaging. Constant civil wars as generals fought for the imperial throne. Economic collapse as currency was debased and inflation spiraled. Plague sweeping through cities, killing massive portions of the population. And most critically, barbarian invasions pressing on every frontier. The empire that had once conquered the Mediterranean world was now fighting desperately just to survive. Resources that had funded lavish games were redirected to military defense. The slave supply that had fed the gladiatorial system was drying up because Rome wasn't conquering new territories anymore, it was losing the territories it already had. Fewer wars meant fewer prisoners. Fewer prisoners meant fewer gladiators. The economic model that sustained the games was collapsing under its own weight. Lanisti found themselves unable to maintain large schools. The cost of training, feeding, and housing gladiators became prohibitive when the return on investment, rental fees from editors, was declining. Some ludus facilities shut down entirely. But there was another factor, one that Rome's founders could never have anticipated: Christianity. Christianity had started as a persecuted sect. Christians were the ones being thrown to the lions, the criminals executed in the arena for refusing to worship Roman gods. But something strange happened over the centuries: Christianity grew. It spread through the lower classes first, then attracted educated converts, eventually even reaching the aristocracy. And Christian theology was fundamentally incompatible with the gladiatorial games. Christianity taught that all humans had souls, that life was sacred, that killing for entertainment was sin. This was radical in Roman context. Roman religion had no problem with the games, many were held in honor of the gods, offerings of blood to ensure divine favor. But Christianity saw them as abominations, moral pollution that degraded everyone involved. The pivotal moment came in 313 CE when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. Suddenly, the Roman state had a Christian emperor. Constantine didn't immediately ban the games, that would have been politically suicidal, potentially causing riots, but he began restricting them. He banned the condemnation of criminals to gladiatorial schools. He reduced funding for games. He used his position to shift cultural attitudes. The rhetoric from Christian leaders became fiercer. Augustine of Hippo, one of early Christianity's most influential thinkers, wrote scathingly about the games. He described a friend who'd gone to the arena intending to close his eyes and not watch, but who'd been drawn in by the crowd's roar, opened his eyes, and became intoxicated with the violence. Augustine used this as a parable about sin's seductive nature, how evil can corrupt even those who think themselves above it. The most famous story from this period, though historians debate its accuracy, involves a monk named Telemachus. According to the tale, in 404 CE, during games held by Emperor Honorius, Telemachus jumped into the arena and positioned himself between two fighting gladiators, shouting for them to stop, declaring that bloodshed for entertainment was ungodly. The crowd, furious at this interruption of their spectacle, stoned Telemachus to death. But Honorius, supposedly moved by the monk's martyrdom, issued a decree ending gladiatorial combat. It's a compelling narrative, one man's sacrifice ending centuries of violence, but the reality was almost certainly more complex and gradual. What we know for certain is that by the early 5th century, gladiatorial games had effectively ended. Not through a single dramatic decree, but through economic collapse, resource depletion, and shifting cultural values driven by Christianity's rise. The last recorded gladiatorial fight in Rome dates to around 435 CE, though the exact date is unclear because by that point, no one was bothering to chronicle them anymore. They'd become irrelevant. Animal hunts, the venations, continued sporadically for another century because they were cheaper to produce and less morally problematic even to Christians. Killing exotic animals was seen as demonstrating human dominion over nature, not the moral degradation of killing humans for sport. But even these eventually faded as Rome's ability to import animals from distant provinces disappeared. What happened to the gladiators themselves? The ones still alive when the games ended faced an uncertain fate. Slaves legally remained slaves unless freed. Some likely continued as bodyguards or private security, their combat skills still had value even outside the arena. Others may have been released simply because their owners could no longer afford to keep them. A few might have been recruited into the army during Rome's desperate final decades. The physical infrastructure slowly crumbled. The Colosseum became a quarry, its stones scavenged for other buildings. Its underground chambers, once housing elaborate machinery for spectacles, became storage. Eventually parts of it became housing for Rome's poor. The great amphitheater that had witnessed so much death was repurposed for life, for survival in a declining empire. And Rome itself? The Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. The vast territory that had stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia fragmented into barbarian kingdoms. The infrastructure collapsed. The cities shrank. The population declined. In a very real sense, Rome died with its games. But the fascination never truly ended. Medieval chroniclers wrote about the games with a mixture of horror and fascination. Renaissance scholars studied ancient texts describing gladiatorial combat. The Colosseum became a pilgrimage site, a monument to both human achievement and human cruelty. In the modern era, we've made the gladiators into myths. Hollywood gives us heroes, men fighting for honor, for freedom, for revenge. We sanitize the slavery, romanticize the violence, impose modern values on ancient brutality. We make them noble because we need them to be, because the alternative, that they were simply slaves dying for entertainment, is too uncomfortable. But perhaps the real lesson isn't about the gladiators themselves. It's about us. About what we're capable of normalizing, rationalizing, celebrating. The Romans weren't monsters, they were people. People who loved their children, wrote poetry, built aqueducts, developed law codes. And these same people filled stadiums to watch human beings kill each other and called it entertainment. They rationalized it. The gladiators were criminals, slaves, barbarians, lesser people, so their deaths mattered less. The violence was controlled, ritualized, lawful, therefore acceptable. It honored the gods, provided employment, entertained the masses, therefore beneficial. Every culture that's committed atrocity has used similar logic. We'd like to think we're different. That we're more enlightened, more humane. But are we? We still flock to spectacles of violence, boxing, mixed martial arts, action films drowning in CGI blood. We're still drawn to watching people hurt each other, we've just changed the rules about how far it can go. The impulse the Romans felt, filling the Colosseum, isn't alien to us. It's uncomfortably familiar. The gladiators are gone. Their bones are dust. Their names, most of them, are forgotten. The Colosseum stands as a tourist attraction, a monument to a vanished world. But the questions they raise remain. Questions about human nature, about entertainment, about what we're willing to accept if everyone around us accepts it too. In the end, perhaps that's why we can't stop telling gladiator stories. Not because we admire the system, but because we recognize ourselves in the crowds. We see the Romans cheering for blood and wonder, would we have cheered too? Would we have questioned it, or would we have bought our season tickets and placed our bets and told ourselves it was just entertainment, just tradition, just the way things were? The gladiators fought and died in the sand. But their real legacy isn't in their victories or defeats. It's in the mirror they hold up to civilization itself, showing us what humans are capable of when we convince ourselves that cruelty can be justified, that suffering can be spectacle, that some lives matter less than others. The games are over. The Colosseum is silent. But the lessons carved in its stone and written in its sand remain, waiting for anyone brave enough to truly see them. 5 centuries of blood. Thousands of lives spent for cheering crowds. An empire that built monuments to violence and called it culture. The gladiators were slaves who became celebrities, men who had everything except the one thing that mattered, freedom. Their story isn't just ancient history. It's a warning about what we're capable of accepting, celebrating, even loving, when we choose not to see the humanity of those who suffer for our entertainment. The sand has been raked clean. But the stains never really wash away.